Welcome back to Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life podcast with Laurel Boyven and Laurel Holland. And today we have a special episode where we are going to take some time, actually the whole podcast, to speak into some questions from our listeners. So the first thing I want to do today is say thank you, listeners, for being on the other side to receive us and then to send in some questions for us, because we really feel like it makes us feel like we're really, together at the kitchen table. Doesn't it, Laura?
It does. Almost a conversation that is happening in the moment.
Yeah.
Really lovely.
It is lovely. So, when we speak into the topics today, and we're gonna go ahead and just kind of do a little reading on the questions or mention the questions, and then we're going to just kind of respond a little bit to them, and then we're going to come back and do a deeper dive on some of the topics that we get into today, because the topics that we're going to be exploring in answering the questions, some of them go a little bit more deep, I think, than we are ready to respond to today in this podcast. We're going to go ahead and come back, and we'll give you a heads up when we're heading in that direction. So the first question comes, and I love this question, Laurel. It's a big question. There's lots of topics in there, so we'll take some time, and then we'll just mention, what we'll come back and talk on. So we've been asked to talk about transitions. So, for instance, people that are going from empty nesters after daily mothering, from people who have children who have grown up and moved out, transitioning from major life work to retirement, and then finding meaning and purpose in a new way. And then how do we deal with fear and loss with these kinds of changes in our lives? And as the question was posed, there's so many examples to this. And wow, what a big topic, huh, Laurel? The idea of tackling transitions in our lives, and especially the big ones.
And I want to say never ending. It's when you really look back on a life, what would a life be without transitions?
Yes.
And I think for me, I categorize major transitions as those that I didn't plan on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And major transitions, right? The ones especially that we didn't plan on, I think feel the most disruptive. The ones that we plan on, somehow in our mind we think aren't going to be as disruptive. But I think it depends on how much prep work you've done, whether it really truly is disruptive, and the level of disruption that you experience in your life, don't you think?
I do.
Yeah.
And whether or not you can continue to do the work through the transition.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the hard part. I know I've had, challenges with that.
Yeah.
When you're in the midst of something big that you didn't expect, knowing that there is some silver lining is not the right word for me at this point, but maybe some lesson in it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that I know when I think about transitions and the transitions, especially the ones I've gone through recently, I think that what happens is we tend to get more triggered in our vulnerable places when we're going through those transitions. And so I think that's why, when you say keep doing the work, the beautiful work, and keep on top of this idea of paying attention to the inner work while we're going through the transition, it really helps to know that most of the time in those transition periods, we do get triggered by the places that we're really still vulnerable, or we need some more growth, or we need maybe to pay some more attention, to ourselves. And so just to know that in and of itself can be good preparation as you enter into a transition time.
Yeah. So can you think of an example that, maybe a transition that you went through that you were triggered during, and how did you recognize it, or how did you move through it with grace?
Yeah, I would say I'm going to just pick the most recent one for me, and it was a really big one. and it was my husband fully retiring. We had a business that we were in together, and it was his full-time work, and I was there very part-time, and then in my coaching business. And so when we sold the business, it was his full retirement. And so going into it, I knew it was going to be a big transition for both of us because I was used to having a routine at home where he wasn't there, and now he would be there during the day. So I knew that was going to be a big adjustment for me. And then for him, he's worked really hard all his life. He was the major breadwinner in both families that he's been in for a long, long, long time. And so the idea of not getting up and going to work every day, not having a purpose in that way, I knew was going to be really challenging for him. So for me, I was, internally, I was really prepared for, wow, we could be really stepping on each other's toes, triggering each other, in terms of like, I know I like the house really neat. If he's too messy, he's going to trigger my stuff and I'm going to be, not really fun to live with. So just knowing, that all of that was coming, right? And so I think part of it is just in our minds, right? Being prepared. I know when I go into a transition, I think this is just going to be a messy time. And it's okay if it's messy. I'm okay. When I moved 3 years ago, that was another really big transition for me. I am such a homebody. And when I had to uproot myself from a home, it was very uncomfortable energetically for me. I had a very difficult time. I literally had a pain in my right leg for a year. I ended up going to the chiropractor and working on it, but it took me a whole year. And it was during those 6 months before I moved and 6 months after I moved, almost to the day that my first chakra was speaking to me through my body, right? So when we go through these transitions, just to know that it's messy, I think that's kind of the first tip, right? Is going into it and saying, this could be a messy part of my life, but it's a new adventure. I think that's how I always look at it, right? It's a new adventure and there are things to learn and ways that we're going to grow. And so I always approach it with an open mind. I think that's kind of where I start. How about you, Laura?
Yeah. So it's so interesting because I know I've had some unexpected major transitions. I mean, we've talked about some of them in our prior podcast, going through a divorce, ending a corporate career, even those, maybe my children going off to college and being an empty nester. And the beauty of all those things being in the past is that they really seemed like there was a start and an end date of that transition, right? So it was knowing that it's going to be messy, knowing that life is going to change, and knowing that eventually it's going to settle down again, and what seems new and maybe challenging or unsafe becomes safe again.
Yeah.
Because we settle into change.
Yeah.
But when I think about the transition, like I'll say my current transition, I'll refer to it as an ongoing transition. So I left my corporate career. It'll be 3 years ago this month.
Yeah. Happy anniversary.
And thank you. And it seemed like it would be a transition that was quick. Like, okay, I'm leaving a corporate career and I'm starting something new. But when I think that it's been a process and a transition that is still ongoing, because it affected so many things. It affected my friend circle, my daily routine, my relationship with my husband, how much time I spend alone or how much time I spend at home, my financial situation, right? And so it really feels like it's ongoing.
Yeah.
And this is probably the first transition I've had that has been ongoing. I don't know how it's going to all sort out. I don't know when it's going to all feel normal again. And I put it in a category of this is life. Life is ever changing, constantly in flux, but we don't really recognize that.
Yeah. I love that, Laurel.
You'll have to ask me a year from now
I
how
know.
did it end?
How did it end? Or did it, or does it? I think, it's interesting because when you started sharing about this major transition that you're in and this new life experience, this new work life experience that you're having, it is almost a version of, I don't want to say retirement, but like watching my husband in his space and then me working part time and feeling like I'm semi-retired because I'm not doing, a million things. I'm only just doing my life coaching. It feels like it's an opportunity, right, to have the freedom to structure your day, which you didn't have before, right? And with retirement, you do. And with this lifestyle, this kind of coaching work, you do to a certain extent, right? And and then it's also a little bit of a journey to find out what fits you the best and how you want to show up as a coach, group coaching, individual coaching, online coaching, what's the face of it going to look like? And I think, really when we come into the retirement years or the time of life where we're slowing down, there's a lot of that happens. There's a lot of, how do I want my day to be and what will feel fulfilling in my day now, and how can I express myself in ways that I haven't necessarily yet. And that's all new. That's all new, right?
It's
Unless you already have
complete,
hobbies that you're going to do, right? Yeah.
it's completely new. And as you were speaking into that, I was thinking about, what if a transition was just, an ending of a phase and a beginning of a new phase, which I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And when we transition sometimes in life, the things, maybe get married, have children, go to work, end a career, retire, all of those are somewhat of an expected pathway or journey.
Right.
And I think what happens with when it's expected or it's part of a normal lifetime, we assume we already know the roles and responsibility that come into it.
Right. Beautiful. Yeah.
But then when, you know, for instance, my leaving corporate, I felt like I was too young to retire. I did joke about being, the at-home wife, which I have never been. And I don't know that that is my calling or my purpose. And I don't know that that's who my husband wants me to be. Um, but I'm at this place where I can decide, as you were saying, how do I want to structure my days? How do I want to work in my own business? How do I want to show up in the world? But it's a little bit messy because I don't have the defined roles and responsibilities
Right.
that I used to have
Yeah.
in whatever phase it was that I was in, that was part of my, expected life trajectory, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I'm making it up as I go along.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of in any transition that we're in, right? Unless you have a structure that's being imposed on you from the outside, like a role at work that where it's just being given to you. We are in places where we're developing the new structure. We're developing the new way of living and being. And so there's trial and error. And it makes me think again about this book that I'm reading, which I just love, and I can't talk about it enough. I'm using it all the time when I'm talking with clients and friends and whatever, is this book called The Path of Least Resistance by Robert Fritz. And he talks about this idea of creativity and the process of creativity and what it feels like to be a creative in the world, right? Beyond just being an artist or a musician or somebody who's we think of as creatives, right? We're all creatives in our own way. And if we're choosing to recreate our life anew, there's actually a way that we do it, a process that we go through. And to kind of know what that looks like is really useful. And it's not the way we've been conditioned to be in the Western world through school, through learning how to adapt to society. Like, it's not about this creative process. And so I always, like, now I'm beginning to realize I think more and more we're entering into a time of humanity where we're trying to relearn how to be creatives.
I think you're right.
Yeah, yeah,
I'll have to look for that book. It sounds fascinating.
yeah. It's really good. I think you'll really enjoy it.
And even when you think about the transitions that we may not choose through life, right?
Yeah.
Death of a loved one, or
Loss of health. I think of loss
right,
of health is, sometimes that just comes on suddenly and we're not expecting it at all. Changes our whole life, right?
a divorce,
Yeah.
similarly, right? Um, and the creative process through that is we still, even though we wouldn't have chosen the transition, we still have the ability to create who we are
Right.
through that transition and because of that transition.
Yeah, yeah. And I think to be able to look at it that way is a way to become resilient in the experience.
Mm,
And that's where hopefully we're gonna learn and grow more and more, because I do feel like right now we're a bit at a loss. We haven't been taught these ways of being in the world. We haven't necessarily seen them or had them demonstrated for us, and so we don't really know how to approach these parts of life or these experiences and feel confident that we have some skill. And so it's hard to become resilient, but I think we can learn it and we can become resilient. I really truly do. Yeah. So if anybody's
yeah.
out there, I highly recommend this book, The Path of Least Resistance. That's a wonderful book to, particularly if you're in a phase of life where you really are starting a new path. It's a great book to give you some encouragement and some techniques about how to work with it along the way. And let's circle back, Laurel, to this idea of the losses
Mm,
and the grieving that's kind of embedded even in the good stuff, right? Even in the transitions that we want and that are good, there's still some pieces of it where we're leaving something behind. And so there's that grief work that needs to be done, or the sense of loss, the nostalgia, and these feelings all, I think, just really need to be felt and given some time and some attention to, in order not to bury them and have them show up later and disrupt your life.
yeah. It's when you were speaking, it reminded me of a time that um, I moved out of my hometown that I grew up in, and my youngest was going into first grade, and it was a plan. I had been planning this for 2 years. When she was going into first grade, we were moving to a town where I worked rather than I had been commuting an hour. And I wanted to be able to have my children in a school in the same town where I worked so that I could volunteer at school, maybe on my lunch hour. Um, and, it just happened at a year after my mother died. And that first, I was so excited to move and establish a new home in a new community. And during the holidays that year, I really was out of sorts. Even though I still had my same holiday traditions of where I spent Christmas Eve and being with my family back at my sister's house and those kind of things. But I didn't realize it at the time, but it was really grief and loss.
Yeah.
It was, as much as I was looking forward to this new chapter in my life, I still was feeling a loss from, the 32 years prior, right? That, I had spent my entire life
Yeah.
living in the same town
Yeah.
prior to that. So I think it's interesting because we do experience loss even when we choose the change that we are stepping into.
Even when we're excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when we're
Yeah.
excited about it, there's still that level of leaving something behind or a sense of loss. And so if we just quickly touch on, the idea of grieving and loss, one of the first, you know, strategies, tips, words of wisdom I would share is you have to feel your feelings. I think when we try not to, what we do is just delay and usually uh, increase what we're going to end up moving through later. And so to just be with it right then and to feel it and to take time, to maybe do some journaling. I love I think about when we lose someone that we love in our life, we take the time to have a ceremony, usually of some kind, and we talk about the people, and we share stories, and we cry with each other, and we love with each other, and and so I almost feel like it's the same thing in some modified version when we're moving from a house, when we're leaving a career behind, when we're going through a divorce, when our family is changing, when someone goes off to college, like this idea of having time, spending time honoring that part of our life, that experience as it was, having an altar where we set up pictures or have a place where we can go and just look and spend time and just sit with our memories, and enjoy what we know and what we've experienced and cry a little bit. It's there's really beautiful healing paths in all the ceremonial and ritual that we just don't do a lot of necessarily either in the Western culture.
Yeah. And I think it's feeling all of the feelings, cry and laugh, both sides of the spectrum of feel all of the feelings. And I think oftentimes too, the practice of gratitude during these times of loss and transition are, when you are so grateful that you experienced what you had previously and how it, becomes part of you to take forward into the next phase. That you may have lost, a home or a neighborhood or a community or a marriage or a parent, but there's still part of that experience that you can carry forward.
Yeah.
And being grateful for that, again, I think helps settle through just the change that's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. And to embrace it. And I think that when we look at the grief cycle, the classic, Kubler-Ross identified grief cycle, the last stage of that is acceptance and moving on to new life. And that's part of the healing journey. And it's also, again, more towards the end, usually, and we don't naturally, in that grief cycle, we go in and out of the stages and we bounce around a lot. But usually that ending part where we're feeling like we're really going into new life tends to be after we've processed a lot of the earlier, feelings of loss and denial and fear and anger or whatever is surfacing around, the change that's there. But we do at some point have to reimagine life in new ways.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about this ongoing transition that I feel like I'm in. And, while it was my choice to leave my corporate career, but the loss of so many things that were tied to my corporate career and in my identity in that role, who I was, and, how to move into the stage of acceptance of the life I'm creating now.
Yeah.
I'll let you know.
Yeah.
I'm going to walk through those stages of grief and maybe journal on kind of the last couple of years of what I've seen and where I am in that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Laurel. And I want to say thank you for, going there with that too, with that idea of, when we've been in, had a career and really identified with our career or really enjoyed our career, it's hard to disidentify from it and then begin to identify ourselves outside of that, right? That's a whole process. And I know that you gave that to us as a challenge in an earlier podcast. And I don't remember which one it was exactly. It might have been one of the values, but it was the idea of learning how to, sharing, introducing yourself or describing yourself without work, right? Or a role that you're in. And that's a great way to be able to find the steady part of you that might grow and change, but it's kind of, again, that essential you that's always there. And if we identify more with that, then the roles will come and go, and we feel that inner stability that carries us through and beyond all those transitions. So that would be, I guess, my other tip or strategy for something.
Yeah, and that I think that challenge of, who are you without your work identity and without your roles in relationship identity, that also would be so helpful in the empty nest phase of life,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
um when I am a mother and my children leave home and they never move back in, who am I
Yeah.
without being the mother of children? Even though I'm always going to be their mother. um and but it really is a time that some women struggle with, because they don't know, who are they, what's their purpose, what's their role, how do they fill their time,
Yeah.
what keeps them awake at night if it's not their children.
Yeah. Yeah. And what gives them
um
pleasure and excitement outside of that, right? And rest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah,
the most important, I think.
I know, of course,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It is so interesting, and it is one of the, it ties into a question that one of our listeners asked me,
Mhm.
in that, how do we not take on roles and responsibilities, problems that aren't ours, when we are back in the situation? And so I can give the example of, my adult child who hasn't lived with me for 7 years shows up for 2 weeks and lives with me when she's between homes. And I immediately then become the mother of a child in my house again.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And how do I remember that my role and my responsibility is no longer, my identity is not simply that one thing anymore?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's a good question too, from our listener. Thank you, listener, for bringing that into the space, because I think some of that, it's like one of the beautiful, more probably intricate processes of doing the inner work is being able to go in there, right, and see how are you showing up in relationships. Are you the problem solver? Are you the rescuer? Are you the one that heroically saves the day, right? And I love this idea because it makes me always think of Jung and archetype work. Carolyn Mace's work is so beautiful. Anybody read any of her work? And she talks a lot about this idea of archetypes, and we have them. We live in them. Jung identified that we live in this collective unconscious with all these archetypes, and Caroline Mace really gets into how we all have a certain body of archetypes within us, and usually one of them is rescuer, right? That's we all want to be the rescuer at some level. And the question is, how much do you identify it, and how much do you get in there and start rescuing everybody, right? And so yeah, and it's one of those hard things. I think when you're transitioning out, or when your children are going, how do you do that gracefully as a parent? Start saying, it's not my problem, it's their problem. It's not my problem, it's their problem. If you're the problem solver at work, how do you help other people get good at solving problems so you're not the go-to person all the time? This is not easy, is it?
It is not easy. It is one of the things that I coach a lot on, is knowing your role and knowing your tendency to take on the role and responsibility of others because you're capable, right? And
Yeah.
it's so messy. It's messy.
Yeah.
What is my place in relationship to others? And is the relationship what it is because I maybe allowed some overextension of my role, right? The fixer,
Yeah. Yeah.
the problem solver.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's so interesting. And when I think about how do we, how do we just keep that in balance or in check? How do we not take on the problems of others that really are not ours. I think it's an ongoing practice, and
Absolutely.
the self-awareness, being aware of, oh, am I out of balance?
Yeah. Yeah.
Am I being helpful, or am I being useful, or am I being needed? All of those
Yeah.
questions come to mind for me.
It's such a great study of self, to go through this process. I think I started looking at that part of my life in my 30s when I was in adult child of alcoholics meetings. And I would talk about this a little bit in another podcast that I did with Pixie when we talk about codependency,
Mm.
because I realized that was where I went in my first of all, it fit my personality, right, to become a codependent, to be the one who was helping other people, and I suddenly became identified as that person, and then I self-identified as the person that helped other people, and then suddenly the boundaries were all blurred, and I wasn't really me unless I was helping somebody else. And I mean, it becomes very complicated, in a dysfunctional household. And yet, for many of us, right, who want to be the helper or want to be the one who feels like you're helping to create a harmonious home environment, work environment, whatever, the lines become blurred. Where is it your responsibility, and then where have you crossed the line, and it's really you're picking up somebody else's personal work or professional work that they should be doing. And so now you're in shaky territory around how to withdraw, how not feel resentful because now you're doing somebody else's thing that they really should be doing, but you went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, this is messy. For
It's so
sure.
messy. I think it's 3 more episodes on this topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to refer anybody to the codependency podcast that I did with Pixie. Also, go back and revisit the relationship podcast that you and I did, because I think we hit a little bit too about women and relationships and self-definition and our psychology, and we get into that a little bit, because I think all of those are all really important for particularly if you're in a pattern where you feel like you are trying to withdraw from being the rescuer or the helper, the enabler, the fixer, right? How do you begin to do that gracefully?
Yeah, and with courage. I mean, I don't know that we've talked about how much courage it takes
Yeah.
to change your own behavior
Yeah. Yeah.
in a way that will benefit you,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that it may upset a relationship, or you may be changing your role within a relationship, and that's risky sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. It is.
So
And so it does take bravery. It does take courage. Yeah.
yeah.
And I think that's why communication could be so key too in helping. And I know when I was studying to be a mental health counselor and was doing a lot of my own personal development work heavily in my 30s and then into my early 40s when I was doing my master's work. And I felt like that was my time when I really could see my patterns clearly of my tendency to be a codependent, my tendency to people please, my tendency to show up in relationships as only the listener and not the talker, my tendency, the person who was going to be there for other people always. And in seeing that, I realized I had kind of lost myself, and it was a process of reclaiming myself, and then learning how to communicate in other ways, right? When I was trying to help. So instead of being the problem solver, I was the person who asked the questions of how the other person thought they wanted to approach their problem, right? I learned other ways to show up. And I think that that's kind of maybe one of the keys, right? Is to start to practice some of the new questions or language and ways that you're going to begin to communicate with the people when you're in the patterns that you want to change, because everybody's going to go on a journey. You're not the only one on the journey, right? Everybody, people on the receiving end are, whoa, what just happened?
I think that's really, really good advice about the process. It ties back into, how do you want to show up? What do you need? And then how to communicate and act, with grace to be able to change what you need to change um, without other people wondering what the heck is going on here.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And allowing everybody to have some space around the change because you might be ready, right, to be doing it differently, but the other person, who's now suddenly the situation's changed. So it's different. Now it's their turn to figure out how they want to do it differently based on your change. And so to have some space and grace around all of that and communicate, and even ask, how are you feeling? I know I might feel to you like I dropped the ball or I'm not helping you anymore, but I started to feel like maybe I was doing something that you could be doing for yourself and I'm not really ultimately helping you become independent or get where you want to go. That was one of the things that I learned in my women's group that was so powerful for me was one of our group agreements was no advice giving.
Mm,
And what I came to truly believe and honor was everybody has their own best advice and they need space and opportunity to get in touch with it internally. And so I think that that was one of the things that helped me too, with withdrawing from being the one who had the answers or the fix it person was they probably know that what they want or need better than I do. So let me see if I can just make some space and support them in getting to that internally. Yeah.
that is incredible. And, it takes trust that the other person does have an inner wisdom, an inner knowing
Yeah.
that is available to them
Yeah.
if you allow it to happen. What a
Yeah.
gift that is.
Yeah. It is. It is a gift. So, Laurel,
I don't
well,
know. We had a lot to talk about. That was only two listeners' questions, I think,
I
that we touched
know.
on.
I know for sure. And lots more that we can probably come back and do some work on. I know I want to come back and we'll talk about grief and we'll do a
Yes.
little bit more with transitions, I think. And then maybe some strategies around, letting go of being the rescuer or the fix it person. I think that would be a good one for us to do, take a little time and talk into that even a little more deeply. Cause I do feel like that's a hard transition to make. And the more support, you can get with that, the better, I think.
I think so too. And I think it ties in. Oftentimes I use the term out of balance. Sometimes we're not in balance with our own gifts, right? So we have a talent or a skill or a gift that is useful and needed, yet we overdo it, right? And so I think that there's some conversation that we can have about how to recognize your gifts and how to use your gifts without overextending and creating an imbalance.
Oh, I love that topic. Let's come back and do one on that, Laurel, real soon.
Mm,
Okay.
okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks today for sharing your wisdom as always, Laurel. It was a pleasure, and thank you, listeners, for sending in questions. We look forward to more. We'll be back soon for more beautiful work, beautiful life.
Mm, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Bye for now.
Bye bye.